So we're going to finish out this piece we started yesterday talking about called funding your vision. Um, Really was kind of the notion of having relationships. You've heard that before. You'll hear it again. Trust me. And the idea of what's the process for inviting people to partner with our organization or with our ministry. Oh, look, there's that definition again, the things that we do to build rational relationships with others. And I can assure you that we have 3 more sessions. I think you will see this at least 3 more times before we're done with the week. So we started talking yesterday about solicitation. I also like the word invitation, but just there's a process for getting people into your database, getting people into your email list, and then how do you begin to qualify and get them to the point where you can actually ask them, invite them to become a partner of some kind in your ministry. So we talked about identifying and qualifying yesterday. We're going to cover cultivating, soliciting, and sustaining today. And we'll have a breakout session at the very end to talk about ways that you can begin to apply some of these things in your organization. So cultivating is really once you have somebody identified, they're in your database, they're in your email list or on your roster somehow, and you begin to kind of think through what kind of person are they? How are they engaged? Is it someone that wants to volunteer for us or someone that wants to donate? We talked about the AID model of attend, involve, and donate. And hopefully you can find a way that if those letters don't make sense for you, that attend, involve, donate, find a way that maybe it does. And talked about ways to get people who are doing 1 or 2 of those things to do 2 or 3 and kind of move them up that stair step. We're going to show you that stair step again in a second as we talked about cultivating, because you can really use that process both in the qualifying and the cultivating situation. But this is where I want to refer back to Sunday and that idea that this is a rational relationship. It's not transactional. It's not an arrangement. It's really something where we need to be investing back. And it's like what Keith said when that promise he talked about Sunday in the second session. What do we offer? What do we promise people who become a part of an organization, either as a donor, as a volunteer, however they're connected to us, in a way where they're benefiting as well? And that could just be from the good feelings and the satisfaction, knowing that God is at work in our organization, and it might be something more than that. So that's kind of this cultivating. We really start to figure out where people are and where they are kind of connected. And there are lots of ways, just like qualifying. We talked about qualifying by wealth. We talked about qualifying by position or job or profession. Other ways to kind of look at cultivating as well. So we can look at the same ladder stair step that we used yesterday when we think about cultivating as we did for qualifying. And again, the idea of trying to get people to move from one level of engagement, one level of activity to another and start to get more levels of engagement and more levels of activity. So this is just more of a reminder. Let's think through and move from cultivating to soliciting. I also like to use the term inviting because soliciting for many people has kind of a negative connotation. In some parts of the world, that has a very negative, illegal connotation. But to think about soliciting or inviting someone, to invite someone to participate, to invite someone to donate, to invite someone to attend a particular event, both work. Most fundraisers, at least in North America, would probably use this term solicitation. It's a personal preference of mine just to use the word invitation, but whichever works best for you and your culture. But here I think the principles, regardless of what you call it, they need to be God honoring. They need to be relational. We've talked about the fact that we're not talking about transactions or arrangements. We're talking about a rational relationship with other people. And many of you in the last time just talked about the importance of having that relationship. That's what got you to introduced to a ministry the first time round. It's what you got you to where you can invite people to help participate as a donor or as a volunteer. So again, it's that invitation process, it's that relational piece that is most important, and many ways actually to invite people in terms of how you do that. And we're going to talk about just something here in a minute about different ways to do that. But I think that not just the idea of solicitation for a donor, but invitations for many other people. We've talked about this already. How can people volunteer? How can they participate? How might they be engaged in a way in addition to donors? We don't want to minimize that, but we don't want to make that our only conversation with them every time we sit down with them. So lots of ways to do that. I just have a few listed there. I've already mentioned during the course of our time together. So let's think about, and I'm gonna probably uh, disagree a little bit with Keith in his conversation the other day. He said have one call to action on each communication. I'm going to suggest that maybe we can have more than one, and I'll explain why, and then you can determine which feels best, which you have most confidence in. But obviously, if you're inviting someone to something, yes is a good word. No is not a good word. When I invited Elaine to become my wife, yes is the word I expected. Yes is the word that I got. No would have been a very different conversation. So we want to offer as many opportunities for people to say yes as they can to what we're asking them to do. So I think because of that, we need to offer them perhaps more than one call to action, although Keith makes a very strong point that because of distraction, because of people's wandering minds, because they get so much email, so much direct mail, they just tell them one thing that they have to do, and I fully support that. But here's a way to look at that slightly differently, and again, you can kind of determine how you think through that. But we want to make sure that whatever we ask them, that there's something they can say yes to. Because if they say no, the relationship begins to falter. The relationship at least goes on pause, if not goes on hold indefinitely. So think back to that linkage idea we talked about a couple of days ago, and that people are linked to your organization. And we're going to introduce a different term now called bridging. And it's really how to keep that relationship growing, how to keep that relationship deepening, how to keep people engaged. So that's kind of a new term in addition to linkage. And we kind of include both those as we think about this idea of inviting people to be a part of what we do. So this is something that Jerry has been saying for 30 years, and it just is he calls it the biggest mistake in development, and it's the failure to bridge. And I've been in meetings, in conversations where we get people together in a room and we're having a conversation about our ministry, and we're at the end of the ministry time or end of the conversation, and it's kind of like there's this big awkward pause because no one quite knows, are we done? Is it over? Are we supposed to go home now? What's going on? Because we've not offered them a bridge to go from one side of the creek to the other, or one side of the relationship to a different side of the relationship. So this bridge idea is one that we think is really important, and it's to keep people moving along that journey, that relationship continuum that we talked about yesterday, to keep them, those little arcs that we had in the PowerPoint, these different exposure events, whether it's before the I and the we or after the us and the we. How does that work? So really think about those exposure events, bringing people to kind of to your front door, and you kind of open the porch and let them kind of peek in and kind of see what maybe you're about, but you don't invite them to come in and participate. So that's what this bridge thing is all about. And you may think of other ways to call it. We call it bridging. I've heard people call it call to action. I've heard people call it invitations. Lots of different things you can call it. But just realize that in our thinking, our way of thinking, and we can argue and arm wrestle over this. We think you want to have a few different things that people can choose from. A, because people like choice. B, one has to be simple enough, easy enough, the bar has to be low enough that everybody can say yes to something. So you don't stunt, you don't cause a pause in the relationship. So here's some samples, and we can think about with something that's really fun to do. We might do at the midwinter retreat. If you are part of the year on mentoring, is really think through all these different ways we can begin to bridge people from one type of engagement to the next type of engagement. So you create a bridge perhaps to get someone from a volunteer to an attender to a donator, that sort of thing. Join a prayer team. Jonathan and others have already talked about that. That's a pretty simple thing. We like to encourage people to actually come up with a 30-day prayer guide for your ministry. Now, for us, that doesn't mean you have to have 30 different things that people pray about. You may say every Wednesday, we want you to pray for the staff of the organization. Every Tuesday, we want you to pray for the missionaries that are going out in the field and being part of that work. Every Wednesday, we want you to pray about the people who are that we're reaching in our ministry, and the people actually contacting and hearing the gospel for the first time. So you can kind of build a calendar around that and not a lot of extra time. And that way people have they all know that everybody's praying for the same thing on the same day. There's some synergy, there's some momentum there. And B, you just have that real power of intercession that's happening with all your prayer partners praying about the same thing on the same day in the same way, because you help guide that prayer time. So not just a prayer team, but it goes back to Jonathan's comment, what's the structure in place to help them do that? For a Christian school, you may have a grandparent classroom helper where the grandparent comes in and helps the teacher in the Christian classroom. What does that look like? There could be a whole team of people. The church that I'm a part of has a Christian school attached to it, and I think there's about 250 students maybe. And I know there are lots of grandparents that come in and help out. So that's kind of a whole nother team. That's a whole nother group that we can then work with in helping them think through, in addition to the classroom help, what else might we help them be able to understand or do or get involved in? We in this country, don't know if culturally this works every place. We just have massive people who drink coffee and spend a lot of money at Starbucks and other places to get the fancy coffees that I don't personally like, but a lot of people do. So we encourage people to join a coffee per week club. So are you willing to give up your $4 US coffee, one a week, and donate that to an organization? Well, $4 times 4 weeks in a month is $16. 16 times 12 is, I can't think what that is right now. 48 maybe? It's higher math. But anyhow, it's an ongoing contribution they provide. And what you're just asking them to do, again, is to sacrifice something. In exchange for that, you might be able to say, well, for $4, we can do a pregnancy test for a young woman who believes that she has an unexpected pregnancy. So you kind of attach it to something. That's Keith's comment, attach it to something that makes sense. You might want them to be a table host for a banquet. Invite four couples that you know to participate in our annual banquet, and you're going to help kind of lead that table and be the host for that table. So there's both financial and non-financial things there. So we think that as you build these bridges, as you have your reply card or your action page on your website, or in the bottom of your email, there might be 2 or 3 things you want to list. Keith would say 1. We would suggest perhaps 2 or 3, but have one of those that might be non-financial, and have one of those that is very simple that everyone can say yes to. Because again, in an invitation, yes is a good word, no is not the word that we want to hear. And you may just begin to tailor that over time. So if you have these kind of programs going on, like this Coffee Per Week Club, you can then say, hey, did you know that we have 13 people who are doing the same thing you're doing this Coffee Per Week Club, and that turns into X amount of contributions over the course of the year, and that results in this sort of impact or this sort of opportunity. You can kind of do the math and expand that out. So you're really communicating with them in a very specific way, because that's where kind of they've put themselves in relationship to you. And I couldn't find it this morning. I wanted to share it. There's a gentleman from the UK who came through this process last year, and he realized as he went out and spoke at churches on behalf of their ministry, he was not doing a good job of bridging so people would know how they could participate, how they could become involved. And he brainstormed a list of about 20 different things that he then started to use in his church presentations. Didn't use all of them at the same time, but you began to use those and actually give people an opportunity to bridge. I think evangelical preachers who give an altar call at the end of their service, that is a bridge of sorts, but I really think that's the only bridge that most pastors know. They don't know, they can't always do well, at least the ones I know, don't do a good job of bridging people into other applications or bridging people into other things that they could be doing. So again, bridging is something important we think is critical that you do. And it's going to be very different perhaps for your ministry than compared to anybody else who's in the room right now. But that's okay. Just realize we always want to give people a chance to do something, this call to action, this invitation. And for us, again, we'd suggest you maybe have 2 or 3 of those, have one of those that's so simple everybody can say yes to, and maybe one that is non-financial, so it's not always feeling like people have to give money every time you send an email or every time you have a communication with them. There's something else that they can do that's not connected to finances or to a donation. Does that seem making sense? Again, for us, it's just making sure that you have a way to get people that next step in the journey, regardless of what that next step is for them. Okay, all right. So here's something else you can be thinking about, maybe on your own time. Kind of what are the the invitations and appeals that you do now. I suspect that you send an email out, and at the bottom of the email you have a checkbox, please do this, sign up here, here's a chance to do a contribution. If there's a hard copy letter that you send out with a postcard, or however that communication works, I suspect there are ways that you try to get people to do this call of action. But just kind of look at those and see if those are the best ones for your organization at this time. um, how do you know when people say yes? And can you quantify who said yes? Because you start to work with those, you might find that some people respond to certain appeals more than others. And if you find that all of a sudden 20-25% of everyone is responding to a particular kind of appeal, well, that might be one you want to repeat and use over again. And I think when it comes to communication, what we end up doing is, because we're so close to it, we see it so often, we see it so many times, that about the second or third or fourth time that we see it and offer it, then we're getting tired of it because we've seen it a lot. And it might be that fourth or fifth or sixth time, because people don't read all their emails. People don't read everything in all their emails. They may not get what the invitation is. It may take 5, 6, 7, 8 times for our audience to realize this is the invitation and take action. So my a lesson I learned a long time ago: don't do anything one time in a row. If you do it once, do it several times until you get the sense that people are really responding and really reacting to your bridge and your invitation for them to participate. And then let's kind of quickly move into sustaining, because this is, I think, just as important as the other 4. So sustaining is, how do you keep that relationship going? How do you keep them in your ministry? How do you keep them as a supporter, whether it's a volunteer, someone who's participating, someone who's an advocate for us, kind of being a spokesperson. And for us, for me and Jerry, it really comes down to, if you're not spending as much time on the sustaining part as the other 4, then you might be coming across as a bit manipulative. I'm not saying that in every situation, but there runs the risk, I think, of, if you're not spending as much time sustaining that relationship, then perhaps it's not as much of a rational relationship as it is a transaction or an arrangement. We have something in what we do that we call the rules of 5. And we have several of those, but here are a few. But it generally speaks to the fact that you're going to have some turnover in your database. You have some turnover in your supporters. People who supported you for a long number of months or years may choose to not support you because they're onto something else. And I understand that. That's attention span, I think, in today's society. But it's also a good kind of awareness. If you're starting to lose more than about 5% of your partners in any given year, there's probably a reason to go back and look at your communication, look at that relationship, look at the relationship of those particular people involved, and is there a way to make sure that they stay a part of our relationship? So some turnover is expected. And some of that you can kind of begin to quantify and see, do we have a problem here because we have so much turnover, so many new people, and so many people leaving? Is there a way we can look at that differently? And maybe that comes down to offering fewer things, or perhaps offering more things, so more opportunity, more options. But obviously, if you offer more options, you have to have the systems in place to offer that many options. And that might be just an internal drain of energy for you and for your team. So just know there will be some turnover. But Jerry came up with this CIA, and it's not the best set of initials. We have AID, we also have CIA. So this is not the US CIA, this is just generic godly development CIA, but really a way to focus on sustaining your relationships. And that's the communication, involvement, and appreciation. So you got to think about those as AID, kind of as people come into the organization, as you begin to qualify them and think about how they might be engaged in your organization, and CIA, communication, involvement, and appreciation, on how to keep them part of your ministry support team. So lots of ways to do that, obviously. Communication, phone calls, emails. I'm not sure if this has been the case in Europe or not, but in the United States, what a lot of nonprofits did, rather than sending emails in the midst of COVID, they just started picking up the phone in calling donors, and made sure that their board members and their staff were calling donors who've been faithful over the years to let them know things are going well. And it was a check-in. It was to see how the donor was doing. How are you surviving in the midst of this COVID pandemic and being locked down, and your health and that sort of thing? It became a real opportunity to minister. Now, you can't probably call every person on your list, very frequently, but you can start to take that in bite-sized pieces and think about making phone calls to those people just as a way to appreciate. I think David yesterday mentioned that a phone call to a donor from a board member just to thank them for their gift, A, encourages another gift, and also B, normally the next gift is larger because they've been had a connection to a board member. So that's, again, a very strategic thing you can do in terms of communication as well as terms of appreciation. And again, we talked about earlier, talk about outcomes and results, not so much activity. Every person I know involved in Christian ministry is always very, very busy. That's just the nature of the work. And yet, want to talk about what God is doing. How is God changing lives? How's God working in my life? How's God working in the donor's life? Talk about outcomes in that communication, not so much activity or busyness. And then involvement, again, way to do prayer prompts, help them volunteer for an event. We've already talked about some of those things. This happens after they give a gift and as they're in that giving process as well. So we've talked about some of those. We always encourage the pregnancy care groups that we work with, the centers, that they have, certain times when they are open to the public because young women are coming in. It's a very discreet appointment perhaps. But early mornings, when they're not open, we encourage them to have the local pastors and the pastors' wives come in and tour the facility. It's like Sarah said, have people go on mission with you. How can they actually participate in what you do? So how can they get involved in that way that's really hands-on? They really start to see how God is working, really start to see behind the scenes of your ministry and of your organization. And then appreciation, obviously. I don't think we can say thank you too much. I know some people say, oh, don't thank me. I'm just doing it because God called me to do that. I understand that, but I still want to thank God for you. And I love the way that Paul does this in the New Testament. He never says, thank you, Timothy. He says, I thank God for you because of how God is working in Timothy's life. So I thank God for you, insert name of donor, for the way that he is supporting, our ministry through you. It puts a different prism on that appreciation, not appreciation and stroking the ego of the individual. You're really telling them how much you are thankful to God for their participation in your ministry. And if Jerry were here, he tells the story. I'll steal it from him. When he was a kid growing up in a farm, he actually, if people would come to the farm, they bring their vegetables, they'd come out for a day and fix fences, whatever neighborly kind of, helpfulness. His mom would always say to Jerry and his two sisters, okay, we need to go thank, the family down the road for what they did. And obviously saying thank you was pretty easy. It was just across the fence. Writing a thank you note was pretty easy too. But Mrs. Twombly always said, okay, what's a third way that you can show your appreciation? And I think in these days of people having easy access to emails, easy access to thank you notes, you hit a button, someone sends a donation, the email system sends out the thank you. It's very generic usually. To be creative with how you show appreciation to people. And that could be maybe a 30-day prayer guide, like I talked about earlier. That might be, maybe it's a book plate that goes in the front of a book that is important to your ministry, and you give them a book, and there's a qualification for when people get that book. Lots of ways to do that, but that's a way that you can be creative within your own ministry. And again, I stole this from Jerry. I see he just logged on, but I stole this from Mrs. Twombly. And it's not just the verbal and the written thank you, but what's that third way that you can show appreciation to people and help demonstrate to them how thankful we are for their participation in your community, for their participation in your ministry.